I want you to help me define a word, if you would. And that word is apathy. Can you define that for me? Or maybe if you want to leave a comment below what you think it means, or at least what it means to you. Now, if you don't want to do that, if you're not really interested in helping me define that word, or maybe you just say, Terry, I don't really care what that word means, then you did a great job. I want to congratulate you because that is being apathetic. Apathy is simply that feeling or that attitude of just disinterest, not being concerned about something, not being interested in something. And I imagine we've all been apathetic, at some point in our life, maybe, in different areas or different arenas. I've talked to a lot of people, over the years, and I've probably felt this myself in the past in certain places. Some people feel apathetic, with their job. It just doesn't interest them anymore. It doesn't excite them maybe how it used to. They just begin to get lax in maybe their job performance, maybe in their excitement for doing their job. Then again, there could be some other reasons like they're just lazy and they don't want to work. Who knows what the real reason is? Apathy obviously is a problem when it invades your life, in your career, your interest. If you're apathetic toward your family or relationship, all those are very bad things and dangerous things. But apathy can be a very serious problem when it begins to creep into your spiritual life. Our passage today over in the Old Testament in the book of Judges occurred between the time of the death of Joshua and the rise of the Jewish monarchy, when God listened to the people who wanted a king, and he was willing to give them one. And the Israelites began here a cycle of spiritual apathy in which they repeatedly begin to turn away from God. Now, a result of this apathy, and in order to deal with this problem among the Israelites, God appointed a series of people that were called judges. And they were appointed by God to deliver the people from their spiritual decline. A woman named Deborah was the fourth of one of these judges. What we find in this book, in the Old Testament book, Judges, is that Israel had, again, returned to its cycle of doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So God allowed them to be oppressed by the Canaanites. And in this case, it was through a man named Sisera. And his army, that it says, included 900 iron chariots. As they went decades under this oppression, the Israelites, began to cry out to the Lord for help, wanting to have the Lord rescue them from this predicament they were in. So we meet Deborah over in Judges chapter 4, verse 4. It says there in that verse, Deborah, a woman who was a prophetess and a wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. It was her custom to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her for judgment. Now, in response to their cry for help, the Lord raised up a prophetess and a judge, and of course we found out her name was Deborah. And Deborah sends for a man called Barak. He was probably a military leader, we don't really know, but when they met, she told him that the Lord had commanded him to lead his people into battle. If we go on down in chapter 4 of Judges, looking at verse 6, it says, this is what she told Barak. Hasn't the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go deploy the troops on Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the Naphtalites and the Zebulunites. Then I will lure Sisera, commander of Jabin's forces, his chariots, and his army at the Wadi Kishon to fight against you, and I will hand him over to you. That was the word of the Lord to Deborah, to Barak. So God had given Deborah here the plan. He had given the steps here, much like we read about over in Joshua and the attack on Jericho. God was the one who had come up with the plan and given it to his people. And then she in hand gave it to Barak. Now, what was Barak going to face in this battle that he was being told he was going to be commanded to go into? Well, these Canaanites, this force under Sisera, was going to be a very powerful and formidable enemy who would have at that time state-of-the-art equipment. Now, what did the Israelite army look like? Well, it wasn't really an army of such at all. We go over into the next chapter to the Song of Deborah, this song of victory that was sung after the battle in Judges chapter 5, verse 8. And we're told there in that song that not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. Now, God was in control of the situation. And God had given his people victory over their enemies even before this battle had begun. And I think it's interesting here that we find in the song that there were at least 40,000 in Israel. But how many did God tell Barak to take into battle with him? He only told him to take 10,000, right? So even the 40,000 weren't prepared, weren't trained, weren't equipped enough to handle this army that they were going up against. Nonetheless, God told them to take just 10,000. But even with this promise from God of victory, what did Barak do? Well, he hesitated. Then in verse 8 it says, Barak said to her, to Deborah, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Now, we can look here and say, well, Barak was a coward. But I think we got to be careful being too harsh on him here. I think what Barak, his hesitation was for a couple of reasons. Number one is he knew what he was going to be facing. He knew what he had to face it with. And number two was I think he just wanted a confirmation that God's presence was going to be with him. Deborah, being a judge, being a prophetess, if she came with him, then he would have confidence that God's presence would be with them in this battle. But obviously, on the surface, Barak must have thought this was a crazy plan. He was going to position a civilian army of farmers and shepherds armed with who knows what, some kind of makeshift weapons and no armor, on a terrain up on this mountainside, on a terrain that would be hard to retreat from, right? The mountain would be behind them. And they'd be facing a well-trained and a well-armed force of iron chariots and infantry. And we look at that and we go, well, no wonder Barak hesitated, right? He knew what he was getting into. The question was, did he lack confidence in the promises of God? So here then Deborah offers him another prophetic word. In verse 9, she says, I will go with you, but you will receive no honor on the road you're about to take, because the Lord will sell Sisera into a woman's hand. So Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Now, when this happens, when the Israelites, when the Hebrew people are victorious, Barak is going to know that he had been called by God to do this, and that God had intervened on Israel's behalf, right? He's not going to, he should be believing it now, but he's not going to get that confirmation until after the battle, as he's looking back, as we say, hindsight's 20/20. But the sign here that Deborah talks about raises the question to Barak at the time, and probably as well to the reader, to us, will Deborah be that woman? Notice, Deborah said there that the Lord will sell Sisera into a woman's hand. So I imagine Barak probably thought, well, Deborah is going with me. This is the new prophecy here that about what's going to happen. So maybe Deborah is the one that the enemy is going to be handed into. And that's probably what the reader thinks, till they get to the rest of the story. So the battle happens. We go on to read through chapter 4, and the battle occurs. The Canaanites are routed. Their army is defeated. The Hebrew people are victorious. But Sisera, the leader of the Canaanites, he apparently at some point gets off his chariot and decides he's going to run away on foot. He sees the battle's not going his way. He comes to a tent. As he's fleeing the battlefield, he comes to a tent of a woman. Her name is Jael, and she seems to be very hospitable and welcoming. In verse 18 of chapter 4, it says, Jael went out to greet Sisera and said to him, come in, my lord, come in with me. Don't be afraid. So he went into her tent, and she covered him with a rug. Now, as far as Sisera was concerned, he was in a safe place. He was being sheltered by someone who lived with a people that had made a peace treaty with his master, so he thought he was in an area where allies lived, and he was hiding in a woman's tent. And at that time, even though he kind of broke that custom by going into the tent, at that time you wouldn't barge into a tent with just a woman in there. You wouldn't search that tent. It just wouldn't be proper etiquette or proper protocol. So she invites Sisera into her tent, and Jael covers him with a rug. It says there, he was thirsty, he was wore out, he was tired, so she gave him some milk to drink, and she said she would keep watch over the tent. And then just when I guess Sisera felt comfortable, and he began to relax, and maybe that weariness just overwhelmed him, and he felt secure, that's when Jael struck. Right? Do you know this story? Have you read it before? Because this is kind of a shocking turn of events. When I say she struck, and I mean that literally, she hammered a tent peg into Sisera's head into the ground. Did you catch that? There was no preamble to this. There was no warning sign coming. While he laid there asleep, she grabs I assume, a wooden tent peg, maybe it was metal. She grabs a tent peg and she hammers it through his head into the ground. Obviously, Sisera did not stand a chance of survival. Now, we think about this and we go, well, what about that prophecy that Deborah told Barak after he had hesitated about going into battle? Well, Barak finally shows up. I guess he's searching for Sisera. He's cleared the field of the army, and now he's looking for their leader. And he comes here to Jael's tent, and what he finds out is that his enemy has already been defeated by a woman. And it wasn't Deborah, right? We don't hear anything about Deborah right now in this part of the story. Instead, she was defeated by Jael. And Barak has lost the glory from his victory, just like God had prophesied through Deborah. Now, again, we see here that God, he uses some very unique methods and some very unusual people to allow his plans to unfold. And when we read an account like this, we're reading the story, there's a battle, there's prophecy, et cetera, and also we get that graphic account of someone hammering a tent peg through someone's head. We might read that and we might be tempted to say, well, you know what, we need to sanitize this a little bit. It's a little gruesome. We might sometimes want to sanitize the Bible and smooth over the parts that make us uncomfortable. Now, of course, the events around Deborah and Barak here, this is not a call for all Christian women. If you're watching this and you're a woman and you're a Christian, this doesn't mean you need to go out and arm yourself with tent pegs. You don't need to be bringing your tent pegs in your bags or in your purses when you come to church. But just because the book of Judges records Jael's actions, it doesn't mean that God approved of them, much like we see in other cases throughout, particularly the Old Testament, which is recording historical events. It simply adds more to that mystery of God's divine providence, demonstrating what the following verses in chapter 4, verses 23 and 24 tell us and affirm that God is willing and God is able to use the very free actions of people to merge those into his plans for his glory and for the salvation of his people, in this case, the Israelites. Jael, she was not even a true Israelite, yet she was going to be the agent of the Lord's vengeance on this oppressor, on this tyrant of the Canaanites. And for that reason, the Israelites praised her for what she did. Even though the method was not approved, her siding with God and God's people, that is what they were praising. And it reminds us, just like it does if you go and you read in Joshua about the city of Jericho and Rahab, who protected the spies in the city and who herself was protected when the city was attacked. It reminds us, like with Rahab, that an ordinary person can choose to side with the Lord, and that shows the power of his promises and of his faithfulness. God, in his infinite wisdom, more wisdom than we can ever have, used two women here in this account to help bring his people out of their spiritual apathy. One woman had a gift. Her name was Deborah. She was a judge and she was a prophetess. The other woman, well, she had nerve, I guess we'd say, right? She had some guts, Jael, to break the leadership of the Canaanite army and to remove this 20-year oppression of the Hebrew people. And we think about who God has used in this account, and we think about how God has used people in other accounts as well. Is it encouraging to you, or is it humbling to you to know that God uses available people, no matter how flawed they are, no matter how unlikely they are? Deborah, a judge, a prophetess sitting under a tree, judging Israel. Jael, basically an unknown woman who lived in a small village in a tent. Does that encourage or humble you that God uses people who are simply available? And when it comes to God's plans and God's commands, when we think about our own self, do we find ourselves being apathetic, or do we find ourselves being available to the opportunities God puts before us, to what we know God has called us to do in his word? This is a very odd and unique story of how God saved the people from their own spiritual malaise, their own spiritual apathy and decline. But it is still a reminder to us too, and a warning to us to guard against our own complacency and our own apathy when it comes to our relationship with God. You know, you can probably think of some ways. How can you guard against spiritual apathy in your own life? Something that doesn't involve tent pegs for sure. And I think, some of the ways we can do that is to just have that consistent time with God, that devotional time, that Bible study, that prayer time with God. I think it's also when we use our gifts, and our abilities in order to serve God, serve His people, serve others as well. And just being active in sharing our testimony, sharing the truth of God's word with other people. When we're engaged in those things, I think that helps to avoid that apathy from creeping into our life. So I just want to leave you with this thought as we end this study today. What steps do you think you might need to take? What steps are you willing to take this week even to help you stay fresh, to help you stay engaged in your relationship with God? It doesn't take very much for apathy to sneak into our life in a lot of areas. And certainly we don't want to see it creep into our spiritual life to where our attitude about God, our attitude about His Word, our attitude about His truth and His commands, our attitude about church and about worship and those kind of things just becomes an attitude of disinterest and a decreasing passion for the things of God. I appreciate you guys taking time to watch this video, and I hope you guys have a great and awesome day in the Lord. And we'll see you when we see you. Bye.